Hello everybody, this is Defeater of Souls. Today we're talking about the cut content of the Dragon Quest Monsters franchise. Now when I say cut content, I mean content that is in the game's files that ultimately was not used in the final product, but can still be accessed, often by hacking or cheating. This is stuff that maybe had an intended purpose in the game, or maybe was just used by the developers to test certain aspects of the game. Either way, you cannot access them in the final product without cheating. So, that being said, let's take a look at the very first game, Dragon Warrior Monsters for the Game Boy. This game has a debug menu. Debug menus are menus set up by the developers in order to test for bugs by examining certain battle aspects, skills, stats, anything that's necessary, sprites, anything that could be used to find bugs. However, in the debug menu, there's actually a tutorial where a white king by the name of Grandpa Sakamoto gives you an explanation of what everything does in the battle. Of course, this is not necessary in the final game, as the final game is not too difficult to figure out, in my opinion. So, the removal of the tutorial seems like a reasonable thing to do. Some more stuff that was found is that the Metal King, who has been present in most Dragon Quest games, is also present in the Dragon Warrior Monsters franchise, where, for cashing in the tiny medals of the game, he'll give you monster eggs. And in the first game, a monster egg he was supposed to give you is the Chop Clown egg. However, this was ultimately removed, reducing the amount of things you are able to get from the Metal Man. A few extra things here. There's some unused encounters that were intended for some of the dungeons in the game. They're nothing too special, just a few guys that never ended up appearing. What is rather interesting, and probably one of the most interesting things in this entire video, in my opinion, is the scrapped final dungeon into the game. In the original Dragon Warrior Monsters game, there was a final dungeon planned. It would have been, like most dungeons in the game, a series of randomly generated floors with a boss at the bottom. However, it wasn't just 20 floors or anywhere near that, it was 99 randomly generated floors. And on the final floor was the final boss of the game, which was going to be Nocturnus. You may know Nocturnus as he is the super boss in Dragon Quest VI, and has a rather minor role in the story of that game as well. However, this was scrapped, making it the only way you're able to even see Nocturnus is if you breed him, which takes an incredibly large amount of time that even I haven't gotten around to doing it. So, that's the first game. So what does the second game have? Dragon Warrior Monsters 2 doesn't have much interesting. It does have a debug menu. Of course, once again, the debug menu just consists of sound tests, sprite viewers, battle tests, things like that to examine certain files of the games to see if they have bugs before it was released in the final version. It does not have a tutorial in the debug menu like the original game did, but it does get the point across. Caravan Heart is a Japanese game, so I don't talk about it too much. It does, however, have a debug menu, and once again, the debug menu allows you to look at multiple aspects of the game to see if there was any bugs before it was released. Now, finally, there's only one game left to talk about, and that is Dragon Quest Monsters Joker. Now, the reason why Joker is the final game is because after the original Joker, all of these games, Dragon Quest Monsters Joker 2, Joker 3, Dark Prince, etc., have no unused content that has been found. Which means if there is anything in the files that weren't used, there is currently no one who has found it and made that visible. So, let's talk about Joker, because Joker does have a lot of unused content. Some of the first earlier things are some unused cutscene graphics. These are generally low quality compared to the final ones in the game. For example, one of the main ones you can see here is an early version of a cutscene where Dr. Snap gives a speech in the main hub world of the game. It's rather low quality and ends up looking much better in the final game, but it does get the job done. A few other interesting images here are some screenshots of early user interfaces. Some include one for the party members, it looks like probably in battle. Another one is likely one for the map, for when you're exploring the overworld, or just as a menu in general. There's also promotional artwork for a separate game known as Dragon Quest Heroes Rocket Slime. Of course, why it's included in the Dragon Quest Monsters Joker games files, I don't know. There's also some unused animations. I'm not going to have them shown in the video, however, I will include a link in the description that will show these unused animations in a separate video if you're interested in them. They include some unused walking animations, some unused duplicate animations for another character, and an unused animation for the final boss. A few extra things here worth mentioning is that there are multiple unused monsters. These monsters don't have English names in-game because they are mostly dummied out, although a few of them do. All of them, however, have Japanese names, and these Japanese names allow them to translate into some of the monsters that did make it into the game just as different recolors, or multiple monsters that were planned to be into the game but ultimately weren't. Some of these include the likes of the Mandrake Marauder, the Small Fry, the Gaspagon, the Wyvern, or the Knight Aberrant. Which would have been interesting to see whether or not how many of these would have been more unique monsters in the game, because if you didn't know that, unique monsters is something that Dragon Quest Monsters Joker is a little lacking in. A few extra things here is there are some unused items in the game. These are skill books that can be used to teach your monsters new skills. These are meant for the 4 of the storyline exclusive party members, Book of Wolfspade, Hawkheart, Diamagon, and Klaboon, so their losses. Only minor. There's also one extra thing here worth mentioning in my opinion, and that is a portrait of Maya Sakamoto. Maya Sakamoto is a famous Japanese singer and actress, voice actress, and often has appeared in multiple video game franchises. You might recognize her as the voice of Aegis in Persona 3, the voice of Aerith Gainsborough in some of the Final Fantasy VII games, or the voice of Lightning in Final Fantasy XIII. What she does not have, however, is any appearances in any Dragon Quest games. So, her portrait could mean that either A, somebody was testing out whether or not they were able to include multiple images in the game from outside sources. Why they would test that, I have no idea, but it's an interesting idea. However, a more interesting theory is that the fact that maybe there was plans for voice acting in the game earlier, but they couldn't handle it on the hardware and was scrapped early on in development. That means they may have included Maya Sakamoto in the game, but it was ultimately scrapped early on. Being said, that's going to be the end of this video. I'm still trying out new things, and I am completely open to new ideas, so if you have any ideas of things I can make videos about, let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. Feel free to like or subscribe, but I'm not going to force you to. I'll just make sure you know that the option is on the table. That all being said, this is Defeater of Souls.